Opening arguments are set to begin today in the trial of a Hells Angels member charged with killing 3 men in Pittsfield in 2011. 14 of 16 jurors have been seated in the trial of Adam.
What happens when men who built their identities around power, loyalty, and control suddenly face a lifetime behind concrete walls? Across decades of investigations, several Hells Angels members have stood in courtrooms as judges delivered sentences that guaranteed they would never return to clubhouses, highways, or the structures they once ruled. Some had commanded chapters, others enforced discipline through violence. When the legal system finally closed in, their reactions revealed something rarely seen inside outlaw motorcycle clubs. The moment authority disappears.
You, upon your oath, do say that the defendant is guilty of murder in the first degree. So say you, Madam Court Lady.
Adam Lee Hall had his head held down as the jury read its decision. Carroll Chadwell Smith shed tears for her brother Robert, Edward Frampton, and David Glasser.
It's sickening. It's sickening. And I hope that nobody ever has.
Number 15. Jimmy, the Weasel, Fratiano associate, Thomas Tommy O'Connor. Thomas O'Connor moved through criminal environments where outlaw motorcycle clubs and traditional organized crime groups sometimes overlapped. Federal investigators had been documenting these connections for years, especially in regions where biker organizations maintained influence over drug distribution and enforcement activities. O'Connor's name appeared in multiple intelligence reports tied to criminal networks operating around biker-controlled territories. Authorities eventually began focusing on O'Connor during an investigation into a present murder connected to organized crime disputes. The victim had been targeted during a conflict involving individuals connected to biker networks and other criminal organizations. Investigators believed the killing had been planned as part of a retaliation operation tied to territorial control and financial interests. Federal agents gradually assembled evidence showing that the homicide had been arranged through contacts inside a criminal network familiar with biker operations. Witness statements, surveillance records, and cooperating informants eventually connected O'Connor to the planning stage of the murder. Prosecutors later argued that the killing had been intended to eliminate a rival figure who had become a threat to the organization's operations. The arrest that followed became part of a larger investigation, examining how violence moved through criminal networks linked to outlaw motorcycle clubs. Authorities suspected that individuals like O'Connor acted as intermediaries who could coordinate violent actions without drawing immediate attention to the organizations benefiting from those actions. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors described the structure surrounding the homicide. The case focused on how the plan had been organized, who participated in the execution of the attack, and how the operation had been coordinated through individuals connected to biker environments. Evidence presented during the trial included witness testimony from cooperating individuals who had previously worked inside the criminal network. Observers present during the proceedings noted the controlled atmosphere typical of organized crime trials. Despite the violent events being discussed in court, the process itself remained structured and procedural. The courtroom environment contrasted sharply with the criminal world described in the testimony. The jury ultimately convicted O'Connor of murder conspiracy. The federal court imposed a life sentence, removing him permanently from the network investigators had spent years attempting to dismantle. For law enforcement agencies tracking organized crime linked to biker groups, the conviction represented another step in targeting individuals responsible for coordinating violent enforcement actions. During the sentencing phase, observers described the moment as restrained. Organized crime defendants rarely display dramatic reactions when verdicts and sentences are delivered. The process instead unfolds quietly as court officials complete the formal procedures required to transfer the convicted individual into federal custody. The case highlighted a pattern investigators had increasingly documented. Violence tied to biker networks often moved through intermediaries who operated between different criminal organizations. These individuals coordinated actions that protected trafficking routes, resolved disputes, or removed rivals, threatening the stability of illegal operations. By the time O'Connor entered the prison system, federal investigators had already begun pursuing additional cases involving figures connected to similar networks. Each conviction revealed more information about how organized crime groups interacted with biker clubs across different regions. Number 14. Michael Harry Bowman. Michael Bowman operated inside the Hells Angels structure in Canada during a period when law enforcement agencies were aggressively targeting biker leadership connected to organized crime operations. Within the Ontario Hells Angels network, Bowman was considered a trusted member who moved inside circles closely tied to the club's senior figures. Police investigators believed that individuals in these positions often played critical roles in coordinating criminal activities that ranged from drug distribution to enforcement actions against rivals. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, Canadian authorities launched several major investigations aimed at dismantling biker-linked criminal networks across Ontario and Quebec. These operations relied heavily on surveillance, informants, and intelligence gathered over long periods of time. Investigators were attempting to map the internal hierarchy of the Hells Angels and identify the individuals responsible for organizing violent crimes tied to territorial disputes and internal discipline. Bowman's name eventually surfaced in a homicide investigation connected to the biker environment in Ontario. Authorities suspected that the killing had been ordered to settle an internal dispute related to organized crime activities linked to the Hells Angels network. Police investigators began collecting evidence suggesting that several members of the biker organization had participated in the planning and execution of the murder. The case became part of a larger strategy used by Canadian law enforcement agencies. Instead of focusing only on individuals who carried out violent acts, investigators attempted to demonstrate that the crimes were connected to the internal structure of the organization itself. This approach allowed prosecutors to present the homicide as part of a broader system of organized criminal activity. When Bowman was arrested, the charges included first-degree murder connected to the biker network. Prosecutors argued that the killing had been carried out with planning and coordination involving several individuals inside the Hells Angels environment. The trial that followed drew significant attention because it represented another attempt by Canadian authorities to link biker leadership to acts of violence. Inside the courtroom, investigators presented testimony and evidence describing how the homicide had unfolded and how the participants were connected to the Hells Angels structure. Witness statements and investigative reports attempted to establish that the crime was not an isolated incident but part of the enforcement mechanisms used within the biker world. Observers described the courtroom atmosphere as controlled and tense as the proceedings unfolded. Organized crime trials involving motorcycle clubs often attract intense media attention due to the long history of violence associated with those groups. Despite that attention, the legal process followed the structured procedures typical of major criminal trials. The jury ultimately found Bowman guilty of the murder charge. The judge imposed a life sentence under Canadian law, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his life within the prison system, subject to parole restrictions that would keep him incarcerated for decades. The moment of sentencing produced little visible reaction. Individuals who have operated inside organized criminal hierarchies often maintain a controlled demeanor during court proceedings. Even when facing the most serious punishments available under the law, Bowman's conviction became part of the broader effort by Canadian authorities to weaken biker leadership structures by removing individuals connected to violent enforcement operations. Each successful prosecution disrupted networks that relied heavily on loyalty and secrecy to function. Number 13. Paul Fonzie Mongols. Paul Eishide. Paul Eishide operated inside the Hells Angels environment during a period when several American chapters were expanding their involvement in methamphetamine distribution across Perth, the western United States. Investigators believed that some members and associates connected to biker organizations had begun forming trafficking partnerships with outside criminal groups in order to move large quantities of narcotics through established biker territories. Federal authorities gradually focused on these networks as part of broader efforts to dismantle organized drug operations linked to outlaw motorcycle clubs. Eishide became a target during an investigation into a violent criminal network responsible for methamphetamine trafficking and multiple homicides. Authorities suspected that the organization relied on individuals who were comfortable operating within the biker environment, where loyalty and intimidation were used to maintain control over distribution systems. Surveillance operations and informant testimony slowly revealed how the group coordinated drug transactions and enforced internal discipline. The investigation eventually connected Eishide to a murder that occurred during a dispute inside the trafficking network. Prosecutors later argued that the killing had been carried out to eliminate an individual who had become a liability to the operation. Law enforcement agencies believed that violence within these criminal systems often served a practical purpose, removing threats to the organization's stability or protecting ongoing trafficking activities. Federal agents arrested Eishide after gathering evidence, tying him to the homicide and the larger narcotics conspiracy. The charges included murder connected to a drug trafficking operation, a combination that carries some of the most severe penalties available under United States federal law. Prosecutors framed the case as an example of how organized criminal networks connected to biker environments sometimes used violence to enforce discipline and silence potential witnesses. During the trial, investigators presented testimony describing the structure of the trafficking operation and the events surrounding the murder. Evidence included witness statements, forensic analysis, and records gathered during the investigation. Authorities emphasized that the homicide had not been an isolated act, but rather part of a broader system designed to maintain control over illegal drug distribution. Observers in the courtroom noted that the proceedings unfolded without visible confrontation. Organized crime cases often attract attention because of the reputations surrounding the individuals involved. Yet the legal process itself typically remains controlled and procedural. The atmosphere reflected the structured environment of a federal criminal trial rather than the violent world described in the testimony. When the verdict was delivered, the jury found Eishide guilty of murder in connection with the narcotics conspiracy. The federal court imposed a life sentence, ensuring that he would remain in prison permanently. The punishment reflected the seriousness of combining homicide charges with drug trafficking offenses under federal law. For investigators who had spent years building cases against biker-linked trafficking networks, the conviction reinforced a strategy that focused on targeting individuals responsible for both violence and large-scale narcotics operations. Removing those participants from the network disrupted systems that depended heavily on trust and internal discipline. The courtroom moment where the sentence was imposed remained quiet. There were no visible reactions that changed the tone of the proceedings. The individual who had once operated within a violent criminal network now faced the controlled environment of the federal prison system. Number 12. Lenny Patrick Leonard. Lenny Patrick spent decades inside the upper ranks of the Chicago Hells Angels, operating in an environment where biker clubs intersected with traditional organized crime groups. Unlike many members who rose through chapter politics alone, Patrick's influence extended into alliances with the Chicago Outfit, one of the most powerful mafia organizations in the United States. Investigators eventually concluded that he served as a bridge between biker networks and mafia operations in the city. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, federal authorities were attempting to dismantle organized crime structures in Chicago, who connected different criminal groups together. Patrick attracted attention because he appeared repeatedly in intelligence reports tied to drug trafficking, extortion, and enforcement activities linked to both biker and mafia circles. One investigation eventually centered on the murder of bookmaker Anthony Tony Spilotro associate Richard Kane. Kane had once worked as a police officer before moving into organized crime enforcement roles for the Chicago Outfit. By the early 1970s, tensions inside the criminal environment surrounding Chicago had intensified, and several violent conflicts emerged between competing factions. Authorities later determined that Kane had been targeted in a contract killing tied to internal disputes within the outfit. The investigation eventually linked Lenny Patrick to the planning of the murder. Prosecutors argued that Patrick's position within the biker world allowed him to serve as an intermediary, capable of coordinating violent actions on behalf of mafia leadership. For years, the case remained unresolved due to the difficulty of securing testimony against individuals connected to organized crime. That situation changed when several high-ranking mafia figures began cooperating with federal investigators during the 1990s. Their testimony allowed prosecutors to reopen old homicide cases that had remained unsolved for decades. Witness statements eventually connected Patrick directly to the planning of Kane's murder. Federal prosecutors brought charges, accusing him of participating in the conspiracy that led to the killing. The case represented a rare moment where a Hells Angels member faced prosecution for involvement in a mafia-directed assassination. During the trial, prosecutors relied heavily on testimony from former organized crime figures who described how Patrick had participated in arranging the murder. The courtroom proceedings revealed the extent to which biker organizations and mafia groups had sometimes cooperated when their interests aligned. When the verdict was delivered, Patrick was convicted of murder, conspiracy. The federal court imposed a life sentence, ensuring that he would spend the remainder of his life inside the prison system. For investigators who had spent decades pursuing organized crime cases in Chicago, the conviction represented the resolution of a long-standing homicide investigation. Observers noted that Patrick displayed little reaction when the sentence was delivered. The courtroom moment reflected the quiet finality that often accompanies organized crime convictions decades after the original crime occurred. The man who had once moved between biker and mafia circles now faced the permanent authority of the federal prison system. The case also demonstrated how long-term investigations into organized crime could eventually expose connections between different criminal organizations. Biker clubs, mafia families, and independent operators often existed within overlapping environments where alliances formed around shared interests. Number 11. James, Jimbo, Nolan. James Nolan operated within the Hells Angels environment during a period when several American chapters were expanding their involvement in large-scale narcotics distribution. Based in California, Nolan became known to investigators as a figure connected to networks moving methamphetamine across multiple states. Federal agencies had already begun focusing heavily on biker-linked drug operations because those networks often relied on trusted internal relationships to move large quantities of narcotics without attracting attention. By the tendentation, early 2000s, federal investigators were tracking a trafficking organization believed to be connected to individuals within the Hells Angels structure. Surveillance operations, confidential informants, and controlled purchases gradually revealed a distribution system capable of moving methamphetamine through multiple cities. The investigation suggested that trusted associates were responsible for transportation, while other members handled financial transactions and distribution. Nolan's name began appearing repeatedly in investigative reports tied to the network. Authorities believed he played a role in coordinating transactions that involved large shipments of methamphetamine. Prosecutors later argued that the organization relied on participants who had established reputations within biker circles, allowing the operation to function through loyalty and internal discipline. Federal agents eventually arrested several individuals connected to the case, including Nolan. The charges centered on conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine and participation in a trafficking network operating across state lines. Prosecutors framed the case as part of a broader effort to dismantle narcotics operations that had been functioning within the environment surrounding outlaw motorcycle clubs. During the trial process, investigators presented evidence gathered during months of surveillance and undercover operations. Testimony described how the trafficking system worked, including the methods used to transport drugs and the financial arrangements tied to distribution. Authorities emphasized the organized structure behind the operation rather than focusing only on individual transactions. Observers present during the proceedings noted that Nolan remained controlled throughout the courtroom process. Individuals connected to organized crime investigations often maintain a restrained demeanor during trials, especially when the outcome becomes increasingly clear as evidence is presented. The conviction that followed resulted in a severe sentence under federal drug trafficking laws. Because the charges involved large quantities of narcotics and a conspiracy spanning multiple participants, the court imposed a punishment that effectively removed Nolan from the criminal network for the rest of his life. The life sentence reflected the seriousness with which federal courts treat large-scale narcotics conspiracies. For investigators who had spent years attempting to disrupt biker-linked drug networks, the outcome represented another example of how long-term surveillance operations could eventually lead to leadership figures facing the most serious penalties available under federal law. The courtroom moment, where the sentence was delivered, remained quiet and procedural. There were no visible reactions that drew attention from observers. The man who had once participated in an organized trafficking system now faced the structure of the federal prison system where authority and influence from the outside world carried little meaning. Nolan's conviction also illustrated how drug trafficking prosecutions had become one of the most effective tools used by law enforcement against outlaw motorcycle clubs. Violent crimes often proved difficult to prosecute without cooperating witnesses. Narcotics cases, however, could rely on recorded evidence, undercover operations, and financial tracking. As investigators continued targeting biker-linked networks across the United States, cases like Nolan's became part of a larger pattern. Each conviction removed another participant from a system that relied heavily on trust and internal loyalty to function. Number 10. Rusty Coons.
What got you involved with the boot campaign?
It's a military benefit for ex-SEALs and soldiers, and I'm just honored to be here because I support the soldiers any chance I get. They're the most honorable people on the planet in my eyes. They give everything for their country and for us. We're sitting back here doing what we do, enjoying life.
Rusty Coons, built a reputation inside the Hells Angels as a figure connected to the organization's operations in the western United States. Associated with the San Fernando Valley chapter in California, he moved within the environment where outlaw motorcycle clubs maintained influence over drug trafficking and other criminal enterprises. Investigators monitoring biker activity in Southern California had long viewed the region as a hub where multiple chapters intersected with broader organized crime networks. Federal authorities began focusing on Coons during investigations into large-scale narcotics distribution. Law enforcement agencies suspected that individuals connected to Hells Angels chapters were helping move methamphetamine through distribution routes stretching across California. The investigation relied heavily on informants, surveillance operations, and undercover agents working inside networks believed to be tied to biker organizations. Evidence collected during the case suggested that Coons had participated in a methamphetamine trafficking operation involving significant quantities of the drug. Prosecutors later argued that the distribution network relied on individuals who used their connections within the biker environment to coordinate sales and transportation. The case formed part of a broader federal effort to dismantle drug operations linked to outlaw motorcycle clubs operating in the United States. When federal agents arrested Coons, the charges centered on conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine. Prosecutors described the operation as a coordinated effort involving multiple participants who had been working together to move drugs through different levels of the distribution chain. The investigation highlighted how individuals connected to biker organizations sometimes used club relationships to build trust within criminal enterprises. During the legal proceedings, the prosecution presented evidence gathered through undercover operations and intercepted communications. Authorities argued that the trafficking network had operated for an extended period before federal agents intervened. The courtroom testimony described how drug transactions had been arranged, transported, and distributed through a system involving several individuals tied to the investigation. Observers noted that the courtroom atmosphere remained controlled as the trial moved forward. High-profile cases connected to outlaw motorcycle clubs often attract media attention because of the organization's reputation for violence and secrecy. Yet inside the courtroom, the process followed the standard procedures of federal criminal trials. The case concluded with Coons pleading guilty to the conspiracy charge. The sentence imposed by the court resulted in several years of imprisonment, removing him from the environment where he had previously operated. The legal outcome reflected the broader strategy federal authorities were using against biker-linked drug networks during that period. Law enforcement agencies had increasingly focused on drug distribution cases because they provided a direct way to target individuals connected to outlaw motorcycle clubs without relying solely on violent crime prosecutions. Financial records, undercover purchases, and intercepted communications often created stronger evidence than investigations built entirely around witness testimony. After his release from prison, Coons later appeared in media coverage connected to television and film projects involving biker culture. The shift illustrated a recurring pattern where former members of outlaw motorcycle clubs eventually moved into public storytelling roles once their criminal cases had concluded. The courtroom where Coons received his sentence represented another example of how federal investigations gradually chipped away at the criminal networks surrounding biker organizations. Each conviction removed one participant from the system, forcing the remaining network to adjust and reorganize. Number 9. Salvatore, Sal, the ironworker. Cazzetta. Salvatore Cazzetta became one of the most recognized figures connected to organized biker crime in Quebec during the early 1990s. Though he was best known as the co-founder of the Rock Machine Motorcycle Club, his activities constantly intersected with the criminal environment dominated by the Hells Angels. During that period, multiple biker organizations were fighting to control drug distribution networks across Montreal and surrounding regions. Investigators believed that whichever group controlled those routes would dominate the province's cocaine market. Cazzetta's reputation inside that environment came from his role in coordinating large-scale drug trafficking operations. Authorities in Canada and the United States began monitoring his activities after intelligence suggested that shipments of cocaine were being transported through Florida and eventually routed into Quebec. The scale of the alleged trafficking operation quickly drew the attention of federal investigators on both sides of the border. By 1994, Canadian authorities moved forward with charges accusing Cazzetta of importing massive quantities of cocaine into the country. The allegations described an international network capable of moving shipments measuring hundreds of kilograms at a time. The investigation also suggested that organized biker groups were using established criminal partnerships to move drugs across multiple jurisdictions. The legal case expanded when American authorities entered the investigation. Evidence gathered during surveillance operations in Florida suggested that trafficking operations connected to Cazzetta had extended into the United States. Federal prosecutors in the U.S. began preparing charges tied to international narcotics distribution, which eventually led to extradition proceedings. Canadian courts approved the extradition request after reviewing the evidence presented by American prosecutors. Cazzetta was transferred into U.S. custody, where federal investigators continued building their case around the cocaine trafficking operation. The prosecution described a structured network that relied on trusted associates, transportation contacts, and financial intermediaries to move drugs and money between countries. Inside the federal courtroom, prosecutors presented evidence linking the operation to large shipments of cocaine entering North America from international suppliers. Investigators argued that the system functioned because of a tightly controlled network built on loyalty and intimidation, elements commonly associated with organized biker crime during that period. The trial concluded with a conviction on major narcotics trafficking charges. The sentence delivered by the federal court carried severe consequences. Cazzetta received a life sentence for his role in coordinating the international drug distribution operation. For investigators who had spent years tracking the movement of cocaine through biker-connected networks, the verdict represented a significant disruption to a powerful criminal system. Observers present in court described the moment of sentencing as restrained and quiet. Organized crime figures rarely display dramatic reactions during proceedings where the outcome has already become clear through the trial process. The courtroom environment instead reflected the procedural reality of a case that had been built over several years of investigation. Cazzetta's imprisonment removed one of the most influential figures connected to biker-linked trafficking networks during the early years of the Quebec biker conflict. Even though he was not a Hells Angels member, his operations existed inside the same criminal landscape that biker organizations were fighting to dominate. Number 8. David Wolfe, Carroll. David Carroll operated at the center of the Hells Angels power structure in Canada during the years when the organization was expanding aggressively across Ontario. Known inside biker circles as Wolfe, he served as a leading figure within the Toronto chapter and later became closely associated with the Nomads, the elite group inside the club that often handled high-level decisions affecting multiple chapters. Law enforcement agencies considered the Nomads the operational core of the Hells Angels in Canada. Carroll's influence became especially visible during the late 1990s as police forces across the country intensified investigations into organized biker crime. Authorities believed the Toronto Hells Angels were deeply involved in large-scale drug trafficking networks that moved cocaine and other narcotics through urban distribution channels. Surveillance operations gradually focused on the individuals believed to be coordinating those activities. Investigators eventually launched a major crackdown that targeted members of the Toronto chapter along with individuals connected to the Nomads. The operation involved extensive surveillance, informant testimony, and financial investigations designed to map out how drug distribution networks were structured. Police believed Carroll's position gave him access to information about multiple operations functioning across Ontario. The case against him formed part of a broader strategy used by Canadian authorities during that period. Instead of focusing only on individual crimes, investigators attempted to dismantle the entire criminal infrastructure surrounding biker organizations. This approach relied heavily on conspiracy charges, allowing prosecutors to present evidence showing how leadership figures influenced activities carried out by other members. When Carroll was arrested, the charges centered on trafficking and conspiracy tied to organized narcotics distribution. Prosecutors described the network as a coordinated system involving transportation routes, suppliers, and street-level distribution managed through individuals connected to biker chapters. The evidence included surveillance material, testimony from cooperating witnesses, and records gathered during the investigation. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution focused on demonstrating how Carroll's influence inside the organization allowed him to facilitate the operation. The case was not framed around a single act of violence, but around the structure of a criminal enterprise operating within the Hells Angels environment. Authorities argued that the network functioned because individuals in leadership positions allowed and supported its activities. Observers described Carroll's demeanor during the legal proceedings as restrained. High-profile organized crime cases often unfold under intense media attention, and the courtroom environment reflected that scrutiny. Reporters, investigators, and members of the public followed the trial closely because it represented another major attempt to connect biker leadership to organized criminal systems. The conviction resulted in a long prison sentence that removed Carroll from the organization's leadership environment. For investigators, the outcome demonstrated that authorities could disrupt biker-linked drug networks by targeting individuals responsible for maintaining the system rather than focusing only on street-level dealers. His imprisonment also illustrated how law enforcement pressure during the early 2000s forced the Hells Angels in Canada to adapt repeatedly. Leadership roles shifted, alliances changed, and new figures emerged to replace those taken into custody. Yet, every major conviction weakened the stability of the network investigators were attempting to dismantle. Number 7. Walter Nurgit Stadnik. Walter Stadnik emerged as one of the most influential Hells Angels figures in Canada during the late 1990s and early 2000s. Based in Ontario, he eventually rose to become the national president of the Hells Angels in Canada. His authority extended across multiple provinces, giving him influence over chapters that controlled large sections of the country's biker-linked criminal networks. Law enforcement agencies viewed him as a central figure, connecting regional chapters into a coordinated national structure. The period when Stadnik held influence coincided with increased pressure from Canadian police forces. Attempting to dismantle organized biker crime, authorities had already seen how leadership figures in Quebec had been tied to the violent biker war. Investigators believed similar command systems were developing in Ontario, where Hells Angels chapters were expanding their control over drug trafficking operations. Police surveillance and intelligence operations gradually focused on individuals believed to be directing those networks. Stadnik's position made him a priority target for investigators. Authorities suspected that decisions involving territory disputes, enforcement actions, and criminal partnerships often flowed through the national leadership structure. One of the most serious allegations linked to Stadnik involved a murder investigation tied to internal conflicts within the biker environment. Police believed that a rival figure connected to organized crime had been killed as part of a dispute involving biker interests. The investigation eventually led authorities to pursue charges against individuals associated with the Hells Angels hierarchy. When Stadnik was arrested, the case immediately attracted national attention. Charging a national president of the Hells Angels represented a rare escalation in Canadian law enforcement strategy. Prosecutors attempted to demonstrate that the leadership structure of the organization played a role in coordinating violent actions carried out by members. The legal proceedings moved slowly through the court system as prosecutors presented evidence tied to the homicide investigation. Witness testimony and investigative reports attempted to connect leadership decisions with the actions of individuals who carried out the killing. The prosecution framed the case as an example of how organized biker hierarchies could influence violence even when leaders were not physically present. During the trial, observers noted that Stadnik maintained a controlled demeanor. High-ranking members of organized crime groups often display little visible reaction inside courtrooms, a pattern investigators and journalists have repeatedly documented during major trials. The legal system operates in a space where the authority once held inside criminal organizations carries no weight. The case ultimately produced a conviction connected to the murder investigation. The sentence delivered by the court removed Stadnik from the leadership structure he had once commanded. For authorities who had spent years trying to connect biker hierarchies to specific acts of violence, the outcome represented a major development. The imprisonment of a national president also revealed how vulnerable even the highest levels of biker leadership could become once investigations reached the courtroom stage. Surveillance operations, cooperating witnesses, and forensic evidence allowed prosecutors to build cases that extended beyond individual crimes and into the broader structure of organized biker networks. After the sentencing, the Hells Angels leadership in Canada underwent adjustments as other figures stepped into positions previously controlled by Stadnik. Organized crime groups often adapt quickly when leadership figures disappear into the prison system. New leaders emerge, alliances shift, and the system continues operating under different management. Number 6. Michael, the Canadian Plante. Michael Plante entered the Quebec Hells Angels during the period when the organization was expanding its control over drug trafficking networks across Montreal. Inside the club, he operated within the Nomads chapter, a group known for its direct connection to leadership figures who coordinated enforcement and large-scale criminal activity. Membership in the Nomads carried a different level of responsibility compared with local chapters. Members were expected to execute decisions that affected multiple territories. During the 1990s, the Nomads chapter became deeply involved in the violent conflict known as the Quebec Biker War. Rival organizations fought for control over cocaine distribution routes that generated enormous profits throughout the province. Bombings, shootings, and assassinations became common as biker groups attempted to eliminate competitors. Law enforcement agencies struggled to identify the chain of command behind the violence. Plante's role placed him close to individuals directing those operations. Investigators later determined that the Nomads chapter functioned as a centralized authority structure. Orders related to enforcement, territory control, and retaliation often originated within this small group. The structure allowed leadership figures to distance themselves from direct involvement, while trusted members carried out instructions. The turning point for Plante came when police investigations intensified during the later stages of the biker war. Authorities began arresting individuals tied to murders, bombings, and trafficking operations connected to the Hells Angels. Facing serious criminal charges and mounting evidence gathered by investigators, Plante eventually chose to cooperate with law enforcement. His decision to become an informant produced one of the most damaging insider accounts ever delivered against the Hells Angels in Quebec. Plante provided investigators with detailed explanations of how the Nomads chapter operated, how violence was authorized, and how criminal profits were distributed across the organization. His information allowed prosecutors to construct cases against senior leaders who had previously remained shielded by layers of loyalty and silence. Inside courtrooms across Quebec, Plante's testimony exposed operational details rarely heard in public. Prosecutors used his statements to connect leadership figures to murders and trafficking operations that had previously been difficult to prove in court. The information helped authorities build larger cases targeting the command structure of the Hells Angels during the biker war. The consequences for Plante were complex. Cooperation agreements offered reduced sentences in exchange for testimony, but the legal system still held him responsible for crimes tied to the organization. His involvement in violent activities placed him directly within the criminal network investigators were attempting to dismantle. Even with cooperation, the legal process left him facing long-term imprisonment. Observers described his presence in court as controlled and cautious. Informants connected to organized crime rarely display visible reactions during proceedings. The risks associated with cooperating against former associates create an environment where restraint becomes a survival strategy. Plante's cooperation ultimately contributed to multiple prosecutions connected to the biker war. Law enforcement agencies used his testimony to demonstrate that violence inside the conflict was coordinated rather than random. The cases reinforced a strategy that focused on dismantling leadership networks instead of only arresting individuals carrying out specific crimes. His story illustrated a recurring pattern in organized biker crime. Investigations. The internal systems built on loyalty and discipline could collapse once a single member decided to cooperate with authorities. When that happened, information that had remained hidden inside clubhouses and private meetings suddenly became evidence inside a courtroom. Number 5. George Christie. George Christie built his reputation as one of the most visible Hells Angels leaders in Southern California. As the longtime president of the Ventura chapter, he maintained influence inside the club for decades. Unlike many figures connected to outlaw motorcycle clubs, Christie frequently appeared in media interviews and documentaries, presenting himself as a spokesperson for biker culture. At the same time, law enforcement agencies continued linking the Ventura chapter to criminal investigations involving violence, narcotics distribution, and organized racketeering. Federal authorities eventually turned their attention to activities connected to the chapter's operations in California. Investigators began building a case around a series of financial crimes tied to insurance fraud. The scheme involved staged motorcycle accidents designed to trigger large insurance payouts. Prosecutors argued that members of the Ventura chapter had coordinated the accidents as part of a structured operation, using the club's internal network to recruit participants and manage the claims. The investigation expanded when federal agents gathered evidence suggesting that the fraud operation had been active for years. Participants allegedly reported injuries that never occurred, filed insurance claims through cooperating clinics, and divided the money once payments were issued. The scheme moved through multiple insurance companies and generated significant financial losses. When federal prosecutors formally charged Christie, the case drew attention because it targeted a well-known chapter president rather than lower-ranking members. The charges included conspiracy and multiple counts connected to mail fraud. Investigators framed the case as part of a broader effort to dismantle criminal systems operating inside outlaw motorcycle clubs. During the trial, prosecutors presented records documenting staged accidents and fraudulent claims connected to the scheme. Evidence suggested that Christie had helped coordinate the operation while maintaining his leadership position inside the Ventura chapter. The courtroom proceedings exposed how financial crimes could operate alongside the club's traditional reputation for violence. The federal court ultimately convicted Christie on conspiracy and fraud-related charges. The sentence delivered by the judge carried long-term consequences. Christie received a prison term that removed him from his leadership role and placed him under federal custody for several years. While the punishment was not technically a life sentence, it represented a major disruption to one of the most visible figures inside the California Hells Angels network. Observers in the courtroom described the sentencing moment as controlled and uneventful. There was no visible confrontation or outburst when the verdict was announced. The reaction reflected a pattern often seen in organized crime cases. Individuals accustomed to commanding authority inside their own organizations suddenly found themselves operating within a legal system that removed that authority entirely. Christie's imprisonment also exposed internal tensions within the Hells Angels. After his conviction, reports emerged indicating that the Ventura chapter had begun distancing itself from him. Leadership changes inside the club structure often follow legal pressure, and the case appeared to trigger shifts in influence across the region. When Christie was eventually released from prison, he no longer held the same position inside the organization he had once led. The The legal case demonstrated how federal investigations could target leadership figures not only through violent crime charges, but also through financial conspiracies that left extensive documentary evidence. Number 4. Yves Apache. Trudeau. Yves Trudeau, widely known as Apache, operated inside the Quebec Hells Angels during the most violent years of the province's biker conflict. Within the organization, he was not known as a strategist or leader. His reputation came from enforcement. Investigators and later court testimony described him as one of the primary contract killers working for the Hells Angels during the Quebec Biker War. His role centered on carrying out attacks that removed rivals, intimidated competitors, and reinforced the authority of the organization's leadership. The violence tied to Trudeau's activities emerged during the 1980s and early 1990s. As biker groups fought for control over drug, police investigations later concluded that several murders connected to the conflict had been executed by a small group of trusted enforcers working under the direction of senior Hells Angels figures. Trudeau became one of the most infamous names connected to those operations. According to court records and police investigations, Trudeau was responsible for an extraordinary number of killings. Authorities linked him to at least 43 murders and numerous attempted assassinations. The attacks targeted rival bikers, individuals connected to drug trafficking disputes, and people believed to have violated the internal rules governing the criminal networks controlled by the Hells Angels. The scale of the violence made him one of the most prolific contract killers ever associated with the biker world. By the early 1990s, law enforcement agencies in Quebec were intensifying their efforts to dismantle the command structure behind the biker war. Investigators focused heavily on identifying the individuals who carried out violent acts on behalf of leadership figures. Trudeau's name appeared repeatedly in witness statements, intelligence reports, and surveillance findings gathered during those investigations. The turning point came when Trudeau was arrested and later agreed to cooperate with authorities. Facing overwhelming evidence tied to numerous killings, he entered into a cooperation agreement that required him to testify against senior Hells Angels leaders. His testimony provided investigators with an inside view of how enforcement orders moved through the organization and how specific murders had been planned and executed. Inside the courtroom, the case produced an unusual legal outcome. Despite being connected to dozens of murders, Trudeau did not receive the life sentence many observers expected. Because of the cooperation agreement and the value of the information he provided against higher-ranking figures, prosecutors negotiated a reduced sentence. The deal allowed authorities to pursue leadership targets who had previously been insulated from direct evidence. The courtroom atmosphere during the proceedings remained tense. Trudeau's testimony implicated powerful figures inside the biker hierarchy and confirmed the existence of structured enforcement operations. For investigators who had spent years trying to prove that violence was organized rather than spontaneous, the statements delivered under oath became a major breakthrough. The consequences for Trudeau himself, however, extended beyond the courtroom. After entering witness protection, he became a marked individual inside the criminal world. In 1994, he was murdered in a suburb of Montreal while still cooperating with authorities. His death reinforced the dangers faced by informants who had once operated deep inside organized crime networks. Number 3. Jeffrey Jethro. Pettigrew. Jeffrey Pettigrew held a powerful position inside the Hells Angels as president of the San Jose chapter in California. Within the structure of the club, a chapter president carries direct authority over members, prospects, and associates, controlling how the chapter interacts with rival motorcycle clubs and criminal partners. Pettigrew's name became widely known during a violent conflict between the Hells Angels and the Mongols Motorcycle Club that had been escalating across several western states. The rivalry between the two organizations produced multiple violent confrontations over the years. Law enforcement agencies across California had been monitoring the conflict closely because both clubs were suspected of involvement in drug trafficking, weapons violations, and organized assaults against rivals. By the late 2000s, tensions between the two organizations had reached a level where investigators believed a major outbreak of violence was inevitable. That escalation arrived in March 2011 during a motorcycle expo at the Nevada casino, inside John Asquaga's Nugget in Sparks, Nevada. Members of both clubs attended the event, bringing two rival organizations into the same crowded environment. Security footage later showed how quickly the situation collapsed into violence when members from both groups confronted each other inside the casino. The confrontation turned into a large-scale fight involving knives and gunfire. Multiple individuals were injured as the altercation spread through the casino floor. During the chaos, Pettigrew was stabbed and killed. His death triggered an immediate multi-state investigation involving Nevada police, the FBI, and law enforcement agencies from California. Authorities quickly focused on several Mongols members who had participated in the fight. Surveillance footage, witness statements, and forensic evidence allowed investigators to identify the individuals responsible for the stabbing. The investigation revealed one of the men charged in connection with the killing was Mongols member Ernesto "Boxer" Gonzalez, who prosecutors argued had played a central role in the attack that led to Pettigrew's death. The trial that followed attracted significant attention because it represented one of the most public violent confrontations between rival motorcycle clubs in recent years. During the proceedings, prosecutors presented security footage and testimony describing how the fight unfolded inside the casino. Investigators explained that rival biker groups had been watching each other throughout the event before the confrontation suddenly erupted. The violence lasted only minutes, but left one of the most prominent Hells Angels chapter presidents dead. The jury ultimately convicted Gonzalez of murder connected to the killing of Pettigrew. The Nevada court sentenced him to life in prison, removing him permanently from the criminal environment where the conflict had taken place. Although Pettigrew himself was the victim, the trial revealed how internal rivalries between outlaw motorcycle clubs frequently result in severe legal consequences for those involved in violent confrontations. Law enforcement agencies used the case as an example of how organized biker conflicts can escalate quickly and lead directly to life sentences for the individuals responsible. Number 2. Maurice, Mom Boucher.
It's a time that, looking back, is almost hard to believe. This was Maurice Mom Boucher at a court appearance for his son. Boucher was the head of an elite chapter of the Hells Angels. Everyone knew Mom Boucher was a killer, and he knew everyone knew.
Maurice, Mom Boucher, became one of the most feared leaders associated with the Hells Angels in Canada. As the head of the Montreal Nomads chapter, he oversaw one of the most powerful factions inside the global club structure. The Nomads were not a typical chapter. Within the Hells Angels system, they functioned as an elite enforcement unit, made up of highly trusted members who answered directly to leadership and operated across territories. During the 1990s, investigators believed Boucher used that structure to centralize control over organized crime networks across Quebec. His rise coincided with the violent conflict known as the Quebec Biker War. Rival motorcycle organizations fought for dominance over drug distribution networks, primarily focused on cocaine trafficking routes in Montreal and surrounding regions. The conflict produced dozens of murders, bombings, and public attacks, many of which occurred in residential neighborhoods. Law enforcement agencies struggled to contain the violence as multiple biker factions competed for territory and influence. Boucher's authority inside the Nomads chapter placed him at the center of the conflict. Investigators described him as a strategic figure who controlled operations rather than carrying out violence personally. Evidence gathered by Canadian police suggested that decisions made at the leadership level influenced a wide range of criminal activities connected to the biker war. By the late 1990s, authorities were focusing heavily on the command structure that allowed a small number of leaders to coordinate violence across multiple chapters. The turning point came in September 1997. 2 Quebec prison guards were targeted in separate attacks. Both men were shot and killed in what prosecutors later described as retaliation against the prison system. Investigators argued that the murders were ordered to intimidate correctional authorities who had begun isolating biker leaders in special prison units. The attacks represented a direct escalation from biker to biker violence into open confrontation with government institutions. Canadian police launched a massive investigation that eventually connected the murders to individuals inside the Hells Angels network. Prosecutors built their case around the idea that Boucher had authorized the killings as part of a broader strategy to pressure prison officials. Testimony, informant statements, and intercepted communications slowly formed the foundation of the prosecution. When Boucher finally stood trial for ordering the murders, the courtroom carried the weight of years of public fear surrounding the biker war. The prosecution argued that his leadership role gave him the power to initiate violence without personally carrying out the acts. Jurors ultimately accepted that argument. In 2002, Maurice Boucher was convicted of ordering the killings and received 3 consecutive life sentences. Observers noted that the courtroom reaction was unusually controlled. The man who had once commanded one of the most feared biker factions in Canada displayed little visible emotion when the sentence was delivered. The legal outcome effectively removed him from the Hells Angels power structure permanently. The Nomads chapter continued to exist, but the authority that had once flowed through Boucher was abruptly severed by the prison system. The conviction became one of the most significant law enforcement victories against outlaw motorcycle club leadership in Canadian history. Investigators had spent years attempting to prove that violence inside the biker war was directed from the top, rather than emerging spontaneously from lower-ranking members. The life sentences delivered to Boucher demonstrated that leadership decisions could eventually return to the courtroom as personal consequences. Number 1. Sonny Barger Ralph.
Sonny Barger founded the Oakland charter of the Hells Angels in 1957. The clubhouse is still here and an operating charter of the Hells Angels. Today, clubhouse members were mourning the loss of Sonny Barger, who became the public face of the notorious motorcycle club.
Sonny Barger became one of the most recognizable figures ever associated with the Hells Angels. As the longtime leader of the Oakland chapter, his authority stretched far beyond a single clubhouse. For decades, he represented the club's public image while also maintaining influence inside its internal hierarchy. Law enforcement agencies in the United States repeatedly connected his name to investigations involving weapons trafficking, drug operations, and organized violence. Even when he appeared publicly as a spokesperson for biker culture, investigators continued documenting his involvement in cases that reached federal courts. By the late 1970s, federal authorities began focusing more aggressively on the structure surrounding Barger and several associates. Investigators believed the Oakland leadership operated as a command center for coordinated criminal activity across multiple chapters. Surveillance, informants, and wiretaps slowly built a picture of how enforcement orders moved through the club's ranks. When prosecutors eventually moved forward with charges tied to violent conspiracies, the case centered on whether the leadership had directed attacks against rival organizations. The most serious moment came when Barger faced federal charges connected to a conspiracy to murder members of the rival motorcycle club, known as the Outlaws. Prosecutors argued that the plan involved explosives intended to destroy a clubhouse used by the rival group. The case drew national attention because it suggested that one of the most visible figures in the Hells Angels hierarchy had participated in planning a large-scale attack designed to eliminate competitors. Federal courts treated the conspiracy as organized violence tied directly to leadership influence inside the club. When the trial concluded, Barger received a life sentence in federal court. The verdict represented one of the most serious legal outcomes ever delivered against a Hells Angels leader in the United States. For investigators who had spent years attempting to link leadership figures to coordinated violence, the sentence appeared to validate the strategy of targeting individuals at the top of the hierarchy, rather than only arresting lower-level members. Inside the courtroom, observers described the moment as unusually restrained compared with the reputation surrounding the club. There was no visible outburst or dramatic confrontation. Instead, the reaction appeared controlled, almost procedural, as federal authorities prepared to move him into custody. The man who had spent years presenting himself as a central authority inside the biker world suddenly faced a reality defined entirely by prison administration and federal supervision. However, the legal battle did not end with the initial sentence. Appeals eventually overturned key elements of the conviction due to procedural issues connected to evidence and jury handling. The The case became an example of how complex organized crime prosecutions can unravel even after major courtroom victories. Barger was later released, though his name remained permanently tied to some of the most significant law enforcement operations targeting the Hells